got a challenge from a Muslim named Fareed.
Not a single video about the disciples being put to death for preaching the resurrection. Why aren't you doing this, David?
Peter, for example, there's two first-century sources, John 21 and 1 Clement 5.
Peter is supposed to have suffered martyrdom at Rome during the reign of the Emperor Nero, being crucified with his head downward at his own request.
So a Muslim calls out David Wood for never giving actual proof for the disciples dying for what they believed in. And it's absolutely amazing. Finally today, Sean McDowell and David Wood give proof that the disciples died for believing in Jesus. Let's get right into it, guys. This is absolutely fascinating.
But very recently, got a challenge from a Muslim named Fareed. And he saw this part of my testimony video and said this.
You guys know why David Wood is a Christian? You guys ever wondered why? Because he used to be an atheist. You know why he's a Christian? It's because of this. Roll the clip, ya Ahmed.
Habibi. What clip?
You don't have the clip? Roll the clip!
I found out how Jesus' apostles died. Most of them went to their bloody deaths claiming that they had seen him risen from the dead.
This is a crazy call out. Anyone who's never watched his testimony, so amazing. Highly, highly recommend, because it will change your view on him as a person.
My explanation for the origin of Christianity had always been that the apostles made up a story so that they could spread his message. But now my explanation wasn't making sense. If you're willing to die for something, you have to believe it. When a terrorist blows himself up, he's obviously sincere. So the disciples, the apostles, had to believe what they were dying for, but this means that they were convinced that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. Now, usually when someone is willing to lay down their life for something, it's for an ideology that they got from someone else, and that ideology could be true or false. The disciples were dying for something that they saw. What could have convinced so many different people that they had all seen a resurrected man? I could explain one witness by saying he's crazy, but all of them, something was going on here and I had to figure it out. But I couldn't come up with any explanation for why they had that level of confidence other than they actually saw him.
David Wood's put out over 1,000 videos in the past few years. Not a single video about the subject. Not a single video about the disciples being put to death for preaching the resurrection. Why aren't you doing this, David? If you put this out, maybe we'll become kuffar. Don't you want that? So put this video out, or tell people, tell your fan base, why aren't you making a video about the subject?
All right, so Fareed, our good Muslim friend, wants to know why I haven't made a video about the deaths of the apostles. I talked about it in a lot of videos, but specifically on that topic. And I thought, well, there's someone who's much more knowledgeable about this than I am. So here I am with Dr. Sean McDowell, who literally wrote the book on the fate of the apostles. So how you doing, Sean?
I'm doing great. We sat down probably 10 years ago.
So now we're going to fast forward to the part where they really get into the deaths and what happened to the disciples. I think this is absolutely fascinating.
But that means we kind of can't know. We can't know if we don't have something reliable that person was basing it on. So when you actually do historical investigation, take into account when the sources are from, and how many sources you have and the quality of the sources and so on, you end up breaking things down into 4 categories based on how much confidence we can have in what's going on. So the group that probably most people are interested in, so you break them down, you break down the apostles into 4 groups. The group that most people are probably most interested in is you have a group where the people on your list have a very high probability of having been martyred based on our information. So just clarify that category and tell us who's in it.
Sure. So I would put 4 apostles in that. 2 of the 12, which would be Peter and James, the son of Zebedee, and then James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. So of the 12, I think only 2 are in the highest level of historical probability or close to it. So if we break this down, Peter, for example, there's 2 first-century sources, John 21 and 1 Clement 5. And Bart Ehrman writes that at least these are sources that the writer is aware of a tradition of the execution of Peter. 2 first-century sources. And then depending on how you assess the sources, there's probably between 6 and 8 more sources in the 2nd century, all within that living memory that unanimously and consistently portray that Peter died as a martyr.
You get this massive, history of church history to say like, yeah, but it's very well known that all the disciples died. But do we actually have any historical writings of this? Just like we have historical writings saying that Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't want to get crucified just like Jesus. But he gets into this a little bit here. And I found this very fascinating, which I had no idea.
Find no good reason to doubt Peter. I put him in the highest level. I put Paul.
One side note, because it's in everyone's head. From Fox's Book of Martyrs, Peter is supposed to have suffered martyrdom at Rome during the reign of the Emperor Nero, being crucified with his head downward at his own request. So you mentioned that we have the sources on Peter and that you have a high degree of confidence that he was martyred.
Yep.
Is it in this specific way or?
Okay, so Fox's Book of Martyrs, the last thing he said is at his own request. Let me ask you a question, David. Do you think the Romans were in the business of taking requests about how you wanted to be crucified?
True.
Part of me says no, but I've known some sick prison guards who, if I would say, no, I don't want that punishment, they'd be like, oh, you want something else? Oh, okay. So I can actually, I wouldn't say it's likely, but I can imagine someone going, oh, you don't want to be crucified the same way? Let us come up with something creative for
That's
you.
funny.
So fair enough. There are some examples of people being crucified upside down. As a whole, the Romans were not invested in trying to kill you the way you wanted to die. It was to humiliate and punish you in the way they thought best made that example. Could there be a possible exception? Sure. But the first time we have Peter being crucified upside down is in the Acts of Peter, which is an apocryphal text written about 180 or 190 AD. Now, I think there's a historical core to this.
Which, at the end of the day, that's not that long after, but it's pretty long.
You don't have the request and the sense of worthiness until appearing later in church fathers that start picking this up in the 3rd and 4th century. But if you read the first account, Peter's upside down. I think a better understanding is he's upside down because the world is turned upside down. And when he's upside down, he can see the world as it is. And Peter's death, like the death of Jesus, can help turn the world right side up. There's a theological reason behind it, as there is in a lot of the apocryphal Acts, rather than a historical one. Now,
wow, that's sad, kind of. Like at the end of the day, I've always used that analogy, or talked about Peter feeling not worthy of something cool. But obviously, there's evidence for him actually being killed, though, for his faith.
That said, one of the areas that I've shifted is I thought Peter was crucified but not upside down. But then a book came out months after my 2015, the first account of the Fate of the Apostles, edited by Larry Hurtado. And there's a chapter in there, and he described that one thing we know about crucifixion, again, in the vast majority of cases, although there might be some exceptions, is that somebody was stripped bare. The idea was to humiliate and shame them. Yet in John 21, what does Jesus tell Peter? You will be taken where you do not want to go. You will be clothed by another. That's enough to give me pause and go, ooh, I think maybe he experienced in the death of Nero, people had these flammable kinds of clothes that were put on to be burned to death. I think that's probably more likely.
No.
Bottom line, whether he was crucified upside down or crucified at all, that doesn't undermine our confidence that Peter died as a martyr, which is...
So he thinks that Peter died burned to death? I didn't even hear of that before. Comment down below what you guys think.
Heart of my task.
So martyrdom, yes, not nearly enough to go on to say something about dying crucified upside down.
Yeah, I would say not enough to go on. I think the weight is against it.
Okay.
But fair enough.
All right, so next you were going with Paul.
Okay, so Paul, not one of the 12, but calls himself an apostle because he saw the risen Jesus. We have one reliable first century source. Some would point towards Acts, and they could indicate a way that it's indicating he was going to be martyred. You could point towards the passage in Timothy where he says, I fought the good fight, finished the race. If that's not written actually by Paul, some people argue 2 Timothy, they were aware that he was about to die as a martyr. We don't have to settle that one, but I think the first century, we have 1 Clement 5, one clear, reliable first century source compared to Peter that has two. Second century, we probably have more like 6 to 8 sources, so a little bit less than Paul, but it's early, it's unanimous, it's consistent. I find no good reason to doubt that Paul died as a martyr. Now, Peter, I put highest possible probability. Paul, I put very probably true, just to try to be careful on my scale.
And for Paul, I always heard that he was beheaded. So I don't know if that's actually true or not.
But we have high confidence Paul died as a martyr. The other two, James, I would put quickly, James, the brother of Jesus. I'm sorry, let's go with James, the son of Zebedee. We had this account in Acts 12. It's one of the only 2 accounts of their deaths we have in the scriptures. Peter, John 21, James, Acts 12:2. Well, a lot of this relies upon the historicity of the book of Acts, which is beyond what we can go into now, but I think there's a strong case for it historically. We also have the reference Licona writes in his commentary when Herod Agrippa, the grandson of Herod the Great, kills him. It reads like an execution account. It's not flowery. There's no legend in it. And it says that this Herod did it to please the Jews. You find confirmation that Herod Agrippa had that kind of posture towards the Jews, unlike Herod the Great in Josephus. So there's kind of this coincidence that incidentally supports it. And then all the later accounts that I could find line up with James dying in this fashion. So I had him originally at highest possible probability, put him down 1 since we only have one source for it. But again, no good reason to doubt that. James, the brother of Jesus, what's interesting about this is he's the only apostle for which we have Gnostic, Christian, and Jewish sources. We have Josephus in the 90s. We have Christian sources like when you get into the 2nd century, Dionysius of Corinth. And then you have like the 1st and 2nd Apocalypse of James, somewhere in the 2nd, 3rd century, possibly one of us is even later, all pointing towards his martyrdom. I actually raised my confidence in James because I found some scholarly journals pushing back on this. And I spent time reading them and engaging with scholars. And when it was done, I thought their arguments so don't work. I'm more convinced he died as a martyr than before.
Yeah.
People can read the book for the details, but I think those 4 were in very solid ground saying they died.
I wish they would explain like how some of them got murdered, or I wish he would go into detail a little bit more.
Martyrs.
And I think the 4-man lineup there is interesting in that you have 2 followers of Jesus, and then you have Paul, who's a persecutor of the early church, and then James, at least according to the Gospels, is not terribly confident that his brother is the Messiah at first, and then later on becomes a leader in the early church. And you try to figure out why Paul and James had such a radical shift, and you're stuck with the resurrection, because that's what the claim was back then. Just wanted to connect this once more to persecution. You're talking about the Apostle Paul, but we have from his own hand some of the descriptions of what this was like. But here, let me pull it up. 2 Corinthians
11.
Yeah,
right?
he says 5 times, verse 24 of chapter 11. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. And so Paul definitely went through a lot of persecution, and he points out that.
And people will be like, well, people die all the time for something that they believe in, but not if they know it is a lie. And second of all, people lie sometimes to gain. These guys are not living lavish lives. Even if you could even say that they didn't die and they still got persecuted. They're not gaining anything from telling people about Jesus.
He's been persecuted more than most others, but also in 1 Corinthians, he puts like the apostles in that category of being what he calls like we're the scum of the earth, and that's how we're treated. And so it wasn't an issue of becoming an apostle. It's a great life.
That's exactly right. I agree
and
with that.
so, and in addition to that, you're concluding that he was most likely martyred. So those are the guys you put in the sort of highest category probability-wise.
Yeah.
And for people who are thinking, why are you talking about probabilities and stuff like that? Well, that's how history works, right?
That's exactly right.
Dealing with ancient sources, you have to figure out the best explanation for the evidence. Okay, so that's the highest category, but the next category would be apostles who kind of seem like they died as martyrs, but the evidence isn't as strong as it is for Peter, Paul, and the two Jameses.
I would put two in this category. I'd put Thomas, and scholars are all over the map with Thomas, from most confident to least confident. Eastern scholars tend to be very confident that Thomas died as a martyr. For Thomas, the earliest source now is what's called the Acts of Thomas. Now you're at 200 to 220 AD. So it's a book that has some legendary content in it, although I think it maintains a historical core. But it's also pushing that living memory boundary. If that's all we had, I'd probably conclude that it's inconclusive. But we also have the traditions of the St. Thomas Christians who don't have an early written record, but they have poems and they have stories and they have songs and traditions, and arguably the burial spot going all the way back to the time that Thomas founded the church in India.
Yeah.
It seems to me that those are independent. Somebody needs to do a doctoral dissertation comparing those two traditions and seeing if we can answer that definitively. Because if the St. Thomas Christians totally rely upon the Acts of Thomas, we have one source. If it's separate, we have two. I tend to think it's two, but we need a deep dive on that. Bottom line, for those first four, if somebody said, are you willing to bet your house that they died as martyred? I'd be like, game on, let's bet it. These, I only would do so if forced to bet my house. I'd say, all right, I'm going to land on the side of Thomas, but with a lot less confidence than the others. Andrew, we have two sources, Acts of Andrew in probably in the 2nd century. And then we have a later writing, maybe early 3rd, called Hippolytus on the 12. Both describe his crucifixion in very different ways that seem independent. So I put that as like more plausible than not, maybe like 51% minimal confidence you could have. But if I had to bet my house, two moderate sources, no contradictory accounts, probably those two died as martyrs.
And it's I've met some of the Christians from the area of Thomas. That's how they explain themselves. We got this from Thomas, and
it's part of their identity for sure. And it goes.
That's always the biggest story is Thomas went to India, shared the gospel, one of the earliest churches there. But at the end of the day, we still could see that everyone is, even if they're 2nd or 3rd century, people are saying that they died for what they believed. Super amazing. So guys, I encourage you to go to Jesus Today. I think there's amazing evidence for Christ and the resurrection of Jesus. So if you've never decided to follow Jesus, I encourage you to do that today. If you want to watch the rest of this video, it will be in the description below. So definitely check that out. Thank you guys so much for watching.